Okay. In today's lecture, I actually want to walk through phase 0 of our Capstone project so that we can start making progress, and then we will return back to regularly scheduled workshops. So with that said, I'm going to publish immediately after this class. I'll publish this PDF, but I want to go ahead and kind of walk through it so you understand what we're going to do in phase 0, and then what it means to move to phase 1 and phase 2, and each continuing phase thereafter. So our capstone project for this class is going to be called Touchless Kiosk System, or it more appropriately, I think, because I have the shared GitHub collaboratory, the GitHub repository set up. So everyone who gave me their GitHub name inside of Discord, you should have gotten an invite to a GitHub organization. So again, to try to keep this as kind of desperatized and organized as possible, we'll have an actual organization for our project. And in fact, for a number of our different repos, you're going to see that one of the repos is going to be the IT workshop series. So once you see that available, which it exists now, those teams who have already presented can either publish their workshop material and their set of slides directly in there, or you can send it to me and I can publish it into the repo. But the idea is that you should all have access to the repo as members with full privileges to them. The same with the project, the Capstone project repository. And so, and then I'll have one third repo that will have the general course materials. So it'll be your one-stop GitHub location where you can get all of the course content moving forward. So with that said, let's talk about the actual Capstone project, because at this point, we're in late September. We need to start making progress towards that if we're going to get anything done. So phase 0, we can call our requirements and analysis phase, but it's also going to end with us creating a roadmap that we can then abide by for the remaining of the semester. So in phase 0 of our Capstone project, we'll focus on gathering insights from stakeholders to inform the development of our touchless kiosk system. This phase is broken into several key tasks that span weeks, potentially 1 through 5. I originally had it weeks 1 through 4, and I might merge part 4 and part 5 together. I'm just letting you know. We are still a little far away from that. So depending on how well our prior parts go, this might be a 4-part phase as opposed to a 5-part phase. But the way that I have it defined now, each week we will try to get a part of this phase done. So it's going to involve identifying our key users, conducting interviews, and translating those findings into actionable user stories and requirements, prioritizing our features, and deploying or developing a roadmap. The roadmap will help guide the system's development through phases. And here, let me make this bigger. Do I have that option here? Okay, there we go. The roadmap will help guide the system's development through phases and ensure alignment with our stakeholder needs. So by the end of our phase 0, all of our pods will effectively merge their work into a GitHub project board. So hopefully we've had an IT workshop illustrating how to use the GitHub project board before we get to that phase. I think that's the project management workshop, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, with that said, once we get to the roadmap phase and we start getting tasks assigned into our project board, then we can start moving to phase 1, which is going to be developing the MVP of our system, our minimal viable product. So the key objectives for this particular phase is, first of all, we need to do The first thing we need to do is our problem definition. So whenever you're inside of, say, a startup, or whenever you're about to develop a product, you have to define, well, what problem does our application solve? So we have an idea based off of a cool instrument and the fact that we have TVs inside of our department that aren't really doing anything interesting. But now we want to develop something cool, but we got to make sure what we think is cool actually aligns with the way that users would actually use this technology. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to do kind of some market research, some market analysis. The first thing we're going to think of is, well, how can we use this technology in a meaningful and impactful way? And when you start talking about building applications that do things, well, they do things for an end user. So those end users are going to be your stakeholders. Those are going to be the people who have a vested interest in utilizing the application you're going to build. So in this first phase, think about what problems we can solve with a touchless kiosk system that's publicly available in the department that are connected to Raspberry Pis. And now the key benefit of a Raspberry Pi is it's a general purpose computing machine, right? Is everyone familiar with a Raspberry Pi? Yeah, so you can install Ubuntu on there, you can install Raspbian on there, you can effectively install Linux on this tiny computer on a board machine that allows you to run any type of application. So think about all the types of applications that might be usefully accessible on these kiosks on side of these televisions once we make them interactive. And then you have to isolate who are those end users going to be. Is it going to be faculty members? Is it going to be current students? Is it going to be prospective students? Is it going to be the tutors? Is it going to be the people seeking a tutor's help? Is it going to be people interested in joining student clubs? Is it going to be the student club leaders? Is it going to be people who have to maintain or administer the actual kiosk technology to be able to update it or make sure it's secure? Like, there's a lot of different types of users that you might consider, and each one of those users can use what would then be considered a stakeholder, but each one of those users would have their own kind of story on how they use that technology. Each stakeholder might use it differently, but they might also use it in a very similar way. So at this time, what we're going to distribute collectively across all the pods, we have 12 pods, all 12 pods are going to work kind of in isolation to identify potential stakeholders, and then to go ahead and develop user stories for those stakeholders. And again, I'll talk more about that when we get to that actual descriptor inside of the instructions. I kept rewriting these instructions again and again and again. I just kind of finally got happy with them earlier this morning. Okay, the second part of this phase is then once we've identified who our stakeholders, once we've identified what problem we solve and who the stakeholders, who the end users are going to be that are affected by our application, and we create guesstimates, we create like a forecast of how our end users are actually going to use this technology, then we're actually going to go ahead and get our stakeholder feedback, our stakeholder input to actually see if our expectations of how they intend to use our software would actually be in line with what they're interested in using. So in this next step, each pod is going to have to go ahead and schedule an interview with at least 2, but I would prefer 3 unique stakeholders from the entire assortment of stakeholders that are identified. Now recall, you might have overlapping, one individual person might be overlapping like roles in terms of stakeholders. And what I might mean by that is a current student might also be a student leader who might also be a student, a member of a student club, right? And so you might have different use cases for when that student or when that person is playing the role of just a current student versus a student who wants to use the application in the form of a student leader versus someone who wants to use that application in the form of a seeker of information about student clubs. So those are all going to be their own kind of discrete things. But when it comes to identifying who you interview, every interview has to be unique. So no pod can interview the same individual twice, because what's going to happen is the pods are going to take on whoever they interviewed as their surrogate stakeholder. So now you, as that pod, are going to represent the interest of those stakeholders. So each pod is going to be responsible for 2 to 3 stakeholders through the process, kind of abdicating and kind of promoting the interest of those stakeholders to ensure that what they want kind of gets fit into the event list, the set of features or tasks that we'll go through the development cycle with. Okay, so once we have interviewed, and the reason you come up with these initial user stories are so that you can inspire or kind of pigeonhole during the interview process so that you can ask meaningful questions, so that you give a sense of expectation to the stakeholders, so you kind of narrow them in on what you're thinking about delivering. But then you can update those user stories, you refine them after the interview process is done. Now recall that these user stories, when we look at them, is going to be more from the perspective of this user would want this feature because it solves this particular problem for them. Effectively, we'll have to then decompose that in the third part where we build out our requirements documentation, and then we do our feature ranking. And so in this stage, the pods will compile a comprehensive requirement document, which details both functional and non-functional requirements, and then kind of get an idea of where they would fall in how critical they are for the application to actually be useful. Finally, after we have our set of features, we'll go into developing our roadmap, which is going to be based on those features, where we can then start to stagger out at what timeline do we have to have each thing created in a cascading set of tasks. So this will give us an idea, starting from once we develop part 4, how much time we have until we have to deliver our end product. And then finally, in the 5th part, and again, I reserve the right to merge part 4 and 5, but in the 5th part, we would just take what each individual team had broken apart from their interviews and to create their own individual set of tasks, along with how it can be staggered to plan for success into a collaborative GitHub project board, so that then the pods can start taking those tasks and then moving them into an in progress section, and then people can start having ownership and start developing code. So this is everything we're going to have to do to get us into a point where we feel comfortable and confident about what tasks have to get done in what time frames, so that we can hit our timetable of actually delivering on a project. So this is just the big picture view. Does this kind of make sense in terms of like a breakdown moving forward? That's a very good question. So the question is going to be, how do we vote for the task? And so at this point, we're going to talk about that as that problem comes up. It's probably going to be one, and I've been thinking deeply about this. I want to use, I think, a form of pod consensus on things, so we could take the majority vote on a per pod level. So the 3 members of the pod can decide what they might vote on. And then when it comes time to selecting a particular task, if there's interest of 2 different tasks to take that pod, we might do something like ranked voting in terms of how a task might be selected. So, but these are bridges that I am looking forward to crossing when we get to. But I do have some strategies on how we can go ahead and resolve issues where there's 2 pods that want to try to handle the same task. And I'm trying to find the approach that's the most fair, that gives all pods like an equal shot. Does that answer your question? A good question, though, because that is one of the challenging things about trying to bring in like 35, 36 different people into one particular project.
I was just going to ask as well, with all the tech workshops going on as well, will you just discuss like updates on this or?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the question here, again, so I can capture it since I'm recording here, is since we have tech workshops that bring us all the way until Halloween, October 31st, how can I potentially keep sharing information and keeping everything abreast and giving you new information that you're going to need to know as we move along? There's going to be two mechanisms for that. The reason why I want the workshops to be an hour long and not an hour 15 long is it gives me 15 minutes as a primer to share resources and references all the way through the tech workshop series. Now, on those instances where I am going to deliver longer content, such as the Python workshop, which I still need to record and deliver, I can deliver that remotely. So I'll put that inside the playlist, and then I'll announce that this is available online and that you should really watch it if you want to learn how to do Python or if you want to be prepared to do this thing. So I think those are the two mechanisms that will allow me to go ahead and still provide meaningful instruction to you, since we'll have so much time kind of allocated to the workshops for both like updates on the final project or our capstone project, and just updates on things that you will want to know. I mean, in addition to the tech workshops, I also want to bring in some actual industry speakers who have been software engineers for a number of years to speak at a couple of our lectures too. So that's what I have planned in some of our lectures for November. Okay. Any other questions up to this point? This was just a broad view, but I think I gave a lot of details that are in the remaining portion of the document. So the first part, as I said earlier, this is our problem definition and your stakeholder analysis. Traditionally, if you were to look at software development more from the guise of an entrepreneur, one of the things you want to do before you start tackling any project is some analysis. You want to do market analysis, and you want to do an analysis of who your users are going to be. And you want to do, with your market analysis, you'd also see who your major competitors are and what your product would have that the current solutions don't have, right? Like that's effectively what we need to do, because the idea is like our competition right now are just the TVs that are already up there, and they're connected to a computer that just plays like a slideshow. So like what we want to do is we want to create something that is a deeper, more meaningful experience that is more valuable to anyone who might end up using that particular like interactive networked. And so the implications of networked might not be super relevant. I mean, apparent on the surface, but when you start thinking deeply on this part, you might be like, oh, it might be very like very much a requirement that a student leader has the ability to have like a moderator or some kind of admin user account that is accessible from the internet. So we're not just talking about like a closed kiosk, which is dumb, which is not connected to the internet, which is offline. We're talking about a kiosk that will be networked and can be updated remotely from some server Raspberry Pi. So start thinking about how we might want to, how that affects the user stories and who has access to our kiosk from a kind of remote perspective, because those are going to be some of our stakeholders as well.
Can we be our own stakeholders?
Yes, actually, I would allow that, because there are certainly members inside of this classroom who have a better idea than people outside the classroom on what might be useful for these kiosks. But with that caveat, I'll have to make a requirement that at least one of your stakeholders, since each pod is required to have at least two, but I would prefer three. That way each team member can do an interview and kind of have their own stakeholder. But at least one of your stakeholders has to be outside your pod, so that there is an external agent that the pod has to interface with. But I know, for instance, in terms of like the student leader perspectives, I think the best opinions would actually come from inside this room and not outside. So for that reason, I would open that up for, yes, we can have internal pod members be considered stakeholders for this purpose. but at least one external. Now we have 12, and they all have to be unique, like I said earlier. Okay, so in this first, the stakeholders.
Okay,
So like for instance, suppose that you want to use Dr. Christopher Suma as a stakeholder.
you have to be.
Then you have to claim him before any other pod claims him, because once he's been claimed by a pod, that's the like liaison now between Dr. Suma and our developmental studio, right?
And how will we like claim our stakeholders?
I guess it's first come, first.
Yeah, but like where will it be stated so like we don't accidentally?
I'm glad you asked, and that's actually in the document. And actually, claiming and interviewing people isn't until part 2. So that's not going to be, we're doing this on a week per week basis. So we're going to consider this the start of the week, which means that next Thursday is going to be when our first deliverable is going to be. So let's talk about our first deliverable. So in the first deliverable, we're really just thinking deeply about, well, what could we potentially do with a touchless kiosk that is networked? Well, questions you might ask are like, why is the system needed? What problems does it solve? How would it benefit the users and the organization? With that, you can start identifying your stakeholders and then develop basic initial user stories. The user stories initially are going to be pretty simple. Look at this as a sample. As a stakeholder, let's say as a current student, I want to be able to check calendars of faculty office hours, right? So it just illustrates how they might use it in a very practical way. And then we translate that into a set of features that we'll have to implement, or models that we'll have to, software models that we'll have to implement into our system. Okay, then I give lots of examples here. Don't use any of these examples. Well, but these are just very quick examples that I came up with. And really the deliverable here is, now here, we're not talking about collaboration. This is an ideation phase. So we're going to work independently at a per pod level, and the pod's going to be able to think very deeply about all the different use cases that might occur. For that reason, we might have a lot of overlapping user stories. So to ensure that we get a diverse set of user stories, we're going to want to have our stipulation that the requirement of user stories per pod is equal to 10 times the number of pod members. So if that's equally distributed across pod members, you could expect that each pod member should create 10 different user stories. That's user stories, not stakeholders. Now, that means you can either go really deep with one stakeholder and say, let me think of 10 different ways a current student might want to use this, or it allows you to have a diverse set of stakeholders. How might a faculty member use it? How might a student use it? How might a student leader use it? And then you have to develop less user stories per stakeholder that way. So how you get to your like 30 user stories per pod, I don't care, right? You can either go very deep with a particular stakeholder, or you can think broadly across a set of stakeholders. But the goal is to get 30 user stories per team, and we have 12 teams. That'll give us a lot of user stories. Now, since we're working independently, there's a value to that, because we're working kind of in this stochastic kind of hidden, discrete environment. And so what this is going to let us know is when we go to merge our user stories after this week is done, we can identify the ones that most pods submitted, and then we can really rank that as being a really critical user story. See, so by working in isolation at a per pod level, it allows us to come up to a consensus. And so again, one of the things that you had asked, which is a very good question, is when you have this amount of people, how do you start making decisions that are impactful and very quick and rapid so that we can translate it? So one mechanism we can have here is we take the aggregate suggestions and we realize that those are probably some of our most critical features. And so that's why I think for this first step, it's important for our pods to kind of work in isolation, because that'll then kind of have some user stories like more important than others. But what it should also do is give us a really diverse set of user stories that one pod might have thought deeply on that other pods might not have recognized. So this is a big ideation phase, and we're going to kind of distribute and then merge all the ideas together. And so this is actually also going to bring us really close to starting to learn how to use GitHub project board, because you had asked, well, how are we going to claim who we're going to interview? Well, before we can determine who we're going to interview, this is the directory structure. I give directory structure things on how you're going to submit to the GitHub repo. So all these things are just going to be submitted to GitHub, right? Again, if you're not part of the organization, make sure to go into the Discord and share your GitHub username so I can make you a member so that you'll have full access to all the repositories for the 4210 Capstone's organization. So this is just showing you how in this first part, how you're going to submit this so that it's publicly available to all the other pods. Because what we're going to do after this is we're going to want to, and these are just like example templates of what you submit is going to be markdown files. I want to ensure that everyone gets very comfortable doing markdown files. So at least initially, all of your reports will be formatted in markdown so that it gets rendered beautifully inside of GitHub in the repository. So when you just click on it, it'll have all the nice formatting that you want.
Isn't that what the other?
Yeah, they already showed you that.
Can you put their video?
I'm going to put all the videos up, yes. And now that we have a repository for IT workshops, they can take the workshop that they've and their slides and publish that under whatever they want to label their workshop as, documentation workshop or whatever. I leave it to you to. Simpler is better though in terms of naming.
I can figure out how to have.
Oh yeah, so what I'm probably going to have to do is I waited to make the announcement, and then once I have everyone who's in, I'm going to give you privileges. So at this point, I've invited you in, but I haven't given you a role yet. And so once I've given you the role, you should have access to start adding or being able to push or do whatever you need to do inside of those repositories. So at this point, you should be able to see it, but you probably only have like 3 privileges, which are the default privileges. Okay, so moving to next week, so that would be after Thursday, presumably all the pods will be able to look at all the different stakeholders. So if you look the way that we'll turn this in, notice the kind of naming convention that I want to uniformly utilize so that it's easy for all the different pods to easily kind of get an idea of how the user stories are separated is preface your subdivide your user stories based off of the type of stakeholder. So when you identify a stakeholder, it might be like current student, it might be faculty, it might be a student leader, it might be a tutor, it might be a tutee, it might be, who knows, like a high school student, like, I don't know, like just, it might be one I haven't named yet. It might even be specific user groups like IGDA, for instance. So maybe not generally just a student leader, but a particular student organization or robotics. Okay, with that said, then put a hyphen, and then after that, what the stakeholder type is, and then aggregate all your user stories inside of that stakeholder type. And so what this will mean is that when this all gets delivered to all 12 pods, all of you can see very quickly who we have to potentially interview. Because what I'm going to state is you don't necessarily have to schedule an interview for one of the user stories that you've created, right? The entire point is we're going through an ideation phase in part one, where we're all going to kind of identify potential users. And then once we do that, then those potential users all have to be interviewed. So this is where it becomes more of like an open game of, well, who's going to go interview a student leader versus who's going to interview, and you can have multiple groups can interview student leaders, right? Like you don't have necessarily a monopoly on the stakeholder. You just have a monopoly on the individual person. So like you can have, so if like, say for instance, you want to interview a faculty member, but if Dr. Sum is taken, you can go take like Ben Samuel, right? He would work in that same capacity. So this is gonna be a thing. Yeah. And so I'm glad you asked that. I'm gonna be a special stakeholder where I'm going to give what I want from the application across all teams. Because remember, one of the things about the selected person who's being interviewed is that you become the liaison pod to represent that person's interest in our application. I'm going to give you what I want to all of you. So because of that, I'm not an eligible person to be like claimed by a pod. Yeah, I will definitely give tasks that I want in there as well. That might be outside of what some of the other.
So two questions. Number one is, as far as I understand, pretty much everything is open except for that we have some TVs and this fancy thing to navigate the TVs. And that's it.
So the question is, and I'm just repeating it so that if anyone's going to listen to this recording, they can hear the question on the microphone, is everything is free game except for the hardware we're deploying on. And that is absolutely correct. Our restraints as a kind of developer studio is that our computing platform is going to be Raspberry Pis. We will have multiple Raspberry Pis. I think I have 10 different Raspberry Pis. So we can dedicate some Raspberry Pis in a client mode that can serve as like the Kiosk OS that attaches directly towards a TV, and that would directly interface with Elite Motion. And then we can have other Raspberry Pis that are sole purpose is to connect to the client Raspberry Pis, the Kiosk Raspberry Pis, to be able to update them with information or to be able to communicate them in meaningful ways.
So every TV will be using function now?
That's correct. So we have a total of 4 Elite Motions, and I think we have 4 TVs inside the department, right? We have the one that's right next to the main office. You have the one that's right next to the tutoring center. You have the one that's right across from the elevator. And you actually have another one that's like right across here, there. But honestly, actually, I think we have 5. Because we have one that's right across from the data center as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so we won't worry about that. So, but that's a good question to ask, because when we go to deploy the software, we might want to have it not just be a uniform experience for every kiosk. Some kiosks we know, because of the foot traffic and its location in the department, might have like highlighted features that should kind of be relevant towards someone who's maybe standing next to the main office versus someone who's standing next to the tutoring center. Like if I'm near the tutoring center, perhaps there's a mode that we need to toggle on that highlights, oh, I want to go ahead and check if the tutors are available. Other things to think about. You have a general purpose computer that is going to be networked to the internet that has a touchless kiosk. But what this might also mean is perhaps you create a scheduling application so that people can kind of check in to a virtual line for the tutor. So instead of just people lining up in person, you create, and then one of the features of the display is who's in queue to be tutored. And then that can and then the tutor can like update that by inputting and outputting people as they serve them. And then the cool thing about this is another user story, data analysis or data analytics on how much time is each session of tutoring happening. So once you start automating and digitizing processes, it doesn't just make them quicker and easier to manage over physical conditions, but then you can start logging the data and start making more data-driven empirical decisions in the future that you didn't have the opportunity to do. So just some quick ideas out there on potential user stories on like things that aren't directly impactful about the touchless part, but just having an interactive computer available starts opening up ways that you can make the tutoring center better, or ways that you can make advertising around the department better, and even more than just a one-sided like poster. It could be more interactive and whatnot. Like potentially, maybe you can RSVP at parties or put your pizza preferences or things at the interactive kiosk as well.
Can you folks how we can get in touch with some of those students? I don't even know about the students.
Discord and Esco. You can ping the tutors.
Yeah, so there's a special role on the CSCI Discord. There's a special tutor role that's reserved for the paid tutors. The department actually pays a set of undergraduate students to serve as student tutors. And so they'll create a schedule and then they'll be inside of the tutoring center that's right next to that TV. And so you can just @tutor and kind of coordinate or contact that individual. Okay, so that's okay. Is there any questions about the first part?
Let's stop with some of those parts.
No. I recant what I said last class. The weeks start now.
So it's until next Friday.
Yes. So you have until next week to get week 1 done. This is way too much to ask you to do between now and tomorrow. Well, so I've been playing around with my head for a little bit, and then I was hardening the documentation on how we would go ahead and delegate this. And it's certainly a lot of fine tuning to try to figure out what's a good solution with the number of people we have in this class that will make it as kind of seamless as possible so that we don't ever have a weak link that can disrupt the entire workflow of it. Okay, so, but the important thing here is that the ideation phase is going to be awesome, in my opinion, because we'll literally have 36 different people thinking deeply about how you can meaningfully use a general purpose computer system that can run any type of application, has access to the internet, and can be interacted with without having any special kind of peripherals by the end user. They can just use their hands as input. And then with that, once you have those constraints, then you can actually have like QR codes and other things. Like you can make mechanisms where people could potentially use their phones, but the idea is we want frictionless. But doesn't mean in some environments, maybe you want to have the QR code for maybe RSVPing or something.
What if people feel like offer this?
That's a great question. That's one thing that we're going to have to discover when we start delivering our first MVP build. That's going to give you a lot of information about how user friendly is it and how like much friction goes into, yeah, this, I don't need to have like a keyboard or a mouse or my phone to interact with the system, but now like I'm doing this and I just feel kind of awkward. Yeah, we don't know that yet. And that's what during our agile dev cycle, we're going to learn that. And then we'll have to change. We'll have to account for what we learned from that. And that's why it's going to be super important to develop an MVP build so that the stakeholders can start playing around with it and find out what does work and what doesn't work. Because what might end up being the case then is then you have probably touchless input for very basic tasks that would be easy to be able to navigate and get information. But for things that are deeper, like maybe RSVPing, you have like a handoff that you could do that's like, oh, I want to access from my phone. And then like you would hit that button on there, and then it would do like a pair mode. And the pair mode might be, here's a QR code, open your phone. Suddenly with your phone, you can now go into like a web app or something that lets you use your keyboard and mouse and everything from there. We can certainly develop a system that, because it's a Raspberry Pi, right? We can build these technologies out.
So we wanted to.
Great question. These are the things that do have to get addressed. And yeah, so we have multiple people. There's a couple different ways you can approach that. You can give everyone equal access and they're just warring over the cursor, or you can kind of lock whoever the first user is to kind of register control, and any other kind of user who tries to then access it'll deny and say there's a current user who is like the in control user or whatever, the main user. So, and I don't know which is better, right? It depends on what the task is. But you can already see how wide open we could possibly go with this. Okay, is there any other questions? Because this is just part one. This is just the ideation phase. What can we build with these technologies? Who are our users going to be, and how are they going to probably want to use this? And at this point, we're just saying probably going to want to use it. We're predicting things, and that's why it's going to be so important to start to develop relationships with our actual end users. And that's why we bring our stakeholders into the table, and we start with getting feedback from them. And then as we start delivering our MVP, we bring them back in and we have them test it out. And that's when we're like, oh, this is kind of difficult to use, or I kind of want to be able to do this. And then we can start adjusting towards their new sets of feedbacks. And then we can actually eliminate things that we thought were going to be planned additions. We can kick them further back into the roadmap, or we can take things that weren't there and add them into the roadmap. So remember, our roadmap is a guide. It's not a rule set. So it gives us a way of being able to kind of plan to go in the future, but we're not bounded to it. That's the point. Yeah. It's like we're trying to maintain an agile work environment, but you also need a mechanism where you have the ability to anticipate and foreplan. So you have like this downward approach where this top to bottom approach where you're like, let me plan things out before I start touching any technology. And then on the flip side, you have this bottom up approach where it's like, let me start building things and showing it off. And we're kind of to be successful, you can't just strictly do both, right? But you do it in cycles. So you kind of come up with a guide of what you think you're going to have. Like, what are all the possible things we want to do with this? And then you start developing a little of it and showing that off. And then you're keeping the stakeholder in through the development process, and they're helping build out the application that's actually going to get used. So an agile. So I guess the point there is the agile dev cycle doesn't mean there's like no planning. It's just you're not planning from from start to finish all at once. Doesn't mean you don't have a prediction of where the finish line is going to be at. It's like kind of tracking a hurricane. Like you have your cone of uncertainty, and then as it keeps developing along, you get more and more certain about where you're actually what you're actually targeting and where you're going to hit at. And I think that's a really apt explanation, because when you're in the midst of that development cycle, it feels like you're in a hurricane sometimes. Okay, let's see here. Okay, let me get to part two, I guess. Okay, so once we've defined all of our user stories and we've organized it in a way so that groups can easily see who the stakeholders are, the entire point of user stories is to create kind of interview questions, right? So we're creating possible use cases, not just for us, but to actually ask the stakeholder, does this seem meaningful? And they correct you, like, oh, that's not really that important. Or they can be like, well, I actually want to do this. Or they might give you like an alternative to that. So this is where we start scheduling our stakeholder interviews. Now, the way I want to schedule the stakeholder interview is if everyone is in on the project and you've already submitted into the repository your user stories, then we can actually start using GitHub boards to actually assign each pod their interview. And so all other pods will know who's claimed based off of who created the task event of interview Dr. Suma, and then move that into the in progress. Does that make sense? So we'll create effectively a Kanban board that will have our to-do, our in progress, and our completed list. And the very first thing, so that we can all get a feeling of how to do that, will be to schedule our interviews using that GitHub projects board. I think that's a really nice way of introducing that concept, because it's for kind of a non-technical thing. So it gives all pods the ability to see how they can start connecting and communicating with other pods by creating an event and moving it to the to-do list. And then once it's there, once you see, I mean, it'll be visible to all other pods. So once you see that an event is planned or a task is planned by one pod, you know who's locked at. Now, I said 2 to 3. We have, let's say we have two. Minimal would be 24. Maximal would be 36 different stakeholders. So I think that's a diverse set that can grab from students and faculty members and from wherever. So I think that's a good number, more than the faculty members we have too. So we'll force students to be participants. Anyway, you conduct your interviews, and then you go back and you update your user stories and you make them more complete. So here, this gives you the opportunity to flesh out your user stories, and you talk about things like what are the essential features, what are the pain points that could be improved with our solution. So, and what are maybe some surprising insights that you didn't predict you'd get from the stakeholders, and then an idea of how we might integrate that into a workflow. Like, how difficult might it be to potentially implement these particular features? And kind of, you don't have to know right off the bat, like if one of the things that has to happen, as we discussed earlier, is that there's like an admin portal that student leaders might be able to access so that they can upload data to the server that then hosts it to our client Kiosk. Well, then you have to have authentication and authorization systems. So you don't have to know how that's implemented, but know that that's a mechanism, right? If you have something that is non-public privileges, that has to be defined and that has to be planned for. And then you have to start to make decisions. Well, how complicated is something like that to make? And so you give it a guesstimate, because when we start breaking these into tasks that pods can claim and start implementing, some tasks will be easier than others. Some tasks might be able to be accomplished in, say, an afternoon. Other tasks might take 2 weeks to do. So those should not weigh the same amount. So the pod that takes the task that's like 2 weeks worth of work, they should know that they don't have to take a lot more tasks, and they should be given the time to finish up on that. Whereas the one that takes something like an afternoon, like maybe just doing some documentation, should be expected to take tasks more rapid. Does that make sense? So this helps us delineate and give a different weighing or weight to each of the features that have to be implemented. And again, I'll just give some templates on to give you an idea of how you might want to provide this information. So then that leads us to the third part. Once you've conducted the interview, what you need to do then is take the interview and start breaking it into a set of features that our application's then going to have. So like I said earlier, if I need to log into the system, then we need a login system. That's a login feature. So now we can start talking this at a more kind of technical software modeling, where we can apply concepts like abstraction and object orientedness to talk about how our system's going to have to handle certain kinds of roles and responsibilities to allow that kind of behavior in our application. And so that'll allow you, well, what kind of data types is our application going to have to support? Is it going to have like user types? And if it has user types, what different kind of user roles or privileges and things like that? So, and that's what we're going to do in the third week. We'll start taking all of those user stories and translating them into an actual requirements document. But when we do this requirements document, we want to try to identify our requirements in terms of feature ranking. So we need to prioritize some features over others. So you might get a lot of features, but like, for instance, playing Duck Hunt on these might be one if we have a lot, like if we have a lot of time and we're going to put a couple of like easy, fun games that can kind of show off the technology, that would be cool. Probably not a prioritized feature. But if we roll through all of our low-hanging fruit, if we get our MVP up, if we get a feature-rich application, then we can start saying, oh, some of these lower priority things, we can start kind of working on and incorporating into the system. And so here we can create priorities critical, which would be our must-haves, high, which is something we should have in a complete system. MVP is like, what can we get out right away so we can start showing off to our stakeholders? Our high priority means in the ideal deployment, this would be part of that. Then we have medium, which is we could have this, but it's on a cusp. So we can deliver a complete package without it, but it'd be more feature rich with this medium. And then low would just be nice to have. It'd be cool. It'd be bonus to have these things. So again, it should be, and these are things that could potentially change over the course of our development cycle as well. But this gives us, again, a guideline of how to stagger and develop. The end goal of this phase 0 is to create a roadmap that will allow us to know how to start traversing from the beginning where we have nothing towards actually having something at the end of the semester where we can kind of deploy and put our applications right onto the department and start showing them all. And then, as I stated earlier, part 4, which I might merge into part 5, simply so it gives us a week more of starting to develop code, which I think is going to be mission critical for the success of this semester, is we would develop the roadmap based off the features. So now that we have these rich feature lists based off of the interviews, and we've defined these this feature list more in a set of more software-oriented constructs, and we can start identifying how important. Then in this instance, we'd also say, well, how long do we expect something like this might take, right? And you don't have to be an expert. You just kind of like ballpark it, right? Like an admin portal, that might be more complex than building documentation. So I kind of get an idea of if I were to sit down to add this, how long would I be expected to deliver on it? So then once you do that, and so at this point, you're doing that all in isolation, the final thing we have to do is actually set up our GitHub project so that everyone takes their sets of features, they take their priority on it, and we have to come together as pods and merge that all into one mass kind of main list that everyone will be able to operate off of. And then when we do that and we say, oh, is this part of our minimal viable product? Is that part of like our phase 1 build? Or is this going to be like our high priority things? Is that going to be part of our phase 2 build? We can even tag tasks with phases, and then we can filter off of our tag list so that we can see everything that we've identified collectively as 12 different pods as phase 1, and then we can start checking them out. So that a pod's like, I'm going to check this out and put that in my to-do list. And it'll have that weight, that expected weight, and that priority level to know what they should be picking from and how long they should be kind of granted or expected to be working on that. And then what'll happen is we'll also start doing probably digital stand-ups so that if for any reason a pod hits an obstacle and there's the expectation that in 2 weeks they get something done, but they're still not done in 2 weeks, then we have to come together and start talking what was the obstacle that caused that delay and how can we resolve that. And so we'll start talking more about how to deal with that when we start doing more like our stand-ups and we start doing more like pod to pod communication about where we're all at and with me as well in that process. So again, this will give us the roadmap. Once we have this, we'll have the set of tasks that will then allow us to start working towards building our MVP. And then again, we'll take and grab those tasks from the set of tasks that have to be delivered for the MVP, based off of a number of different ways, either through pod consensus or through ranked voting or other things like that. Or if a pod can make a really good argument as to why they think they're the best pod out of the cohort of pods to actually be assigned that task. And again, I'll be the tiebreaker. So I'll have the final decision on what task could potentially go to what pod. So just to resolve any potential issues that might develop. Okay, so that is my idea on how we can get to, and again, this is just a quick screenshot of what the GitHub projects looks like. So with that said, I have the rubric, the basic breakdown of our week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and week 5. And I reserve the right, again, to merge 4 and 5. I prefer to be able to do this in 4 weeks so that we can start developing within the month, which would put us perfect because that means we'd be completing phase 0 of our Capstone project and we'd be completing the IT workshop at around the same time, wouldn't we? So that we can really dedicate ourselves into getting development done in all of the month of November. And hopefully a little bit before then. Maybe, we'll see. Well, let's see. I'm thinking of combining weeks 4 and 5. So week 1 would be, the first one would be identifying the user stories and your stakeholders. And that would be by, let's say, next Thursday or next Friday. And then the Friday after that, you would everyone would have had interviewed their stakeholders. And then after that, you'd create a feature list. So the week after that, you'd create a feature list based off those interviews. And then the week after that, you would go ahead and create your roadmap. And when you create that roadmap, I would prefer for you to digitize it like right away. So there's no reason why you create the roadmap and then we spend a whole nother week merging. So I really feel like I want to do that in 4 parts.
So when it comes to pushing stuff to the repo and adding stuff to it, will there be like permissions for that as well?
Yes. So I'm going to give everyone full permissions. And that's for the explicit rationale that we're going to have to develop policy as a class on who's going to be responsible for doing merging and whatnot. And this will probably be a rotating responsibility across the pods.
Just make sure I'm understanding this correctly. For this first week, we have to go and find who we're going to have as a stakeholder. We don't actually have to interview them.
You don't interview, right? So the first thing we're doing is ideating. The first thing we're going to do is identify user stories, and user stories resolve around stakeholders. So anyone who's going to use our application, we're going to define as a stakeholder. And so stakeholders can come in many different forms. So in the next week, I just want from each pod about 30 different user stories. And that could be across a diverse set of stakeholders or a single stakeholder. I don't really care how it's distributed.
So right now, just kind of ask them generally, like, hey, what would you expect? Don't like interview them.
So at this point, you're not interviewing anyone. So you're working inside you're coming up with predicted user stories.
Okay.
So I think a student leader might want to be able to use it to advertise club meetings. But since you're not an actual student leader, once you've figured out who a stakeholder might be, and you sell a story as to why they would use our application, the next thing you have to do is verify and validate that that is an actual solution that stakeholder is looking to use it for. Otherwise, you're just creating a software application for an end user who doesn't really find value in that. So we have to assure ourselves that the value that we ascribe to a stakeholder is the same value that they ascribe to it themselves. And then, so by next week, really, we're just looking for identifying stakeholders and all the different ways they might use it based off of how you predict. Then, once we identify all the different stakeholders and all the different user stories, which the user stories are now fodder for interview questions, right? Each pod is going to create a relationship with between 2 to 3 different stakeholders and hopefully a diverse set. So like, it would be ideal if we did identify, let's say, for instance, a prospective student as a particular end user, as a particular stakeholder, that at least one pod does prospective students then. And so think that would be in the form of like high school students that come to get to know UNO and kind of check the department out. What are cool things to show off what computer science is about? Yeah, so once you do that, then the next part, the next week after that, will then, the pods will find their own stakeholders and do the interview. And you have a week to identify your stakeholders, hold the interviews, ask them all the relevant questions that could come across all of the different pods, not just the user cases you came up with. All those user stories are open game for every pod. And so that's good, because what that allow is, imagine if like two different pods are both asking faculty members about how to use the software. Well, they're going to be talking to different faculty representatives, but they should be asked the full gambit of questions that all of the pods came up with. That way, they can each have an opportunity to provide those insights. So you get access to what everyone has contributed for the second week when it comes to you creating your interviews. So then by the time you're done the second week, you should have these interviews that allow you to stretch out the user stories. So initially, the user stories are going to be shallow, but your job through the interview process is to harden them and make them much more detail-oriented. And so the idea about detail-orientedness is the week after that is you're going to decompose that set of user stories that have now been refined over into a set of features that the application will have to offer. Now, features are more understandable for developers or implementers to understand than a user story. A user story is something the end user can relate with. That's like, how do I drive the car versus how do I build the car, right? Like the designer of the car has to know what the expectations of the end user is going to be, so they know, oh, I got to put brakes in it and a steering wheel, and I shouldn't put like a push button like transmission. It should be using, most people are familiar with like a stick transmission. So these are the things that allow you to map the user stories to your feature space. And once we get to our feature space, then we can start developing that into our roadmap. And that roadmap will then be published into our GitHub board as a set of desktop-tized tasks that has to be built piece by piece. And then each pod can check out one of those tasks. And each of those tasks have to be ascribed a weight so that we know, is this a task that's expected to be like an hour's worth of work versus like 40 hours worth of work? Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, and just to make sure, so for right now, besides the user stories, we're finding, 2 to 3 people, and we're going up to them and being like, hey, can we claim you for an interview later? And they say yes or no, and that's it, we're done with them this week.
Well, you don't even have to do that this week. If you do that, you get, I guess, the ability to claim people early, but the intent is we're doing the ideation now to figure out what all of the stakeholders are, so that we can have good representation of the stakeholders. I fear that if you start trying to schedule interviews before you see the full list of stakeholders, some stakeholders might get omitted because there's not the opportunity for all the pods to see all the suggestions or all the user stories that everyone else has contributed. So in the perfect world, one where like we're gonna like kind of be blind towards what we're doing in part 2, I would ideally like to see where everyone kind of gives their user stories into the repository, then everyone has an opportunity to look over all the stakeholder names because of the way we're doing our naming conventions. And then you can think of good representation for all those different stakeholders. Because otherwise what might happen is you might have, it'd be like polling, right? You would over poll one segment and under poll another segment. So I want to avoid the polling problem that we might even see in like an election cycle, like right now. Like that's what makes polling difficult, is that you're trying to ascribe a set of, on a group of people, what one person from the group is stating that they want to have or do, right? So what I'm saying is, don't necessarily, I'm not saying you can't start to schedule people, but I want to know who the stakeholders are so that the pods can kind of ensure that at least one stakeholder from all the stakeholding groups has a representative. And that, like, say, for instance, faculty members aren't overrepresented. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, yeah.
And so once we've identified the stakeholders, then, but again, when I see that more user stories are to a particular group, it makes sense to kind of have more of a particular user represented as well. So, like, for instance, students probably should be overrepresented because they're going to probably be one of the largest use cases of who's using the software. So that's also an important thing to keep in mind when you start doing this interview process. So there's a lot of thought that goes into how you select your interviews. So kind of want to be hesitant on just first come first, I know because of the rules of uniqueness, it's going to kind of drive that behavior, but it's really important that we kind of get a broad gauge of the different types of people and their desires and what they want from our application, who are going to be our end users.
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay, is there any other questions? Or does this at least first phase of the Capstone project kind of make sense and how it's going to build us into the next phase?
So now it makes sense to clarify again, we're going to like identify our stakeholders by the end of next week.
Yes,
And
yes, yes. And then so in 1 week, we'll have our list of user stories. And the week after that, we should have all of our interviews done.
okay, so then we'll just like put it all in a Discord channel, like all of our.
It's going to go in the repository. So I'm going to, so that's why today I want to make sure I have everyone added into the repository so that it makes it easier for me then to assign roles. Otherwise, I have to manage who's assigned member and who's just a reader. And it's easy just to go do. Oh, yeah. So here, let me show you. Very good question. So I actually had brought this up. If I log into my GitHub repo here, if I click on my profile, you'll see one of the options here is your organizations. If I click on your organizations, I can see that one organization that I'm a member of is the 4210 Capstone organization. So again, I'm trying to make this as containered as possible so that you can share this out with future prospective employers. And so the idea here is in the this is where our repository is going to live for all the software engineering classes moving forward. And then inside of here, you can see who your team members are. Right here, you can see I currently have 9 people who've accepted this invite, and then I can go in and assign the roles for them. I can check the repositories here. If I click up here, I can see what repositories exist for this organization. And so it's going to be 4210 course resources. So I'm going to slowly bring all of our course material into this repository. It's going to be the IT workshops. So now all the pods can start publishing their slides and their workshop content. But remember, the feedback forms you have to send to me so I can anonymize them and then I'll publish them. So I'm the one who has published the feedback forms. So that way you can give honest feedback and not have to worry about having any consequences from that. And then finally, this is going to be our Capstone project. And I tried to make a title for the Capstone project, something that when you go to share this repository, clearly kind of defines what this project is. So I didn't just call it like Capstone Project 2024, right? Because to a prospective employer, that's an awful name. So here we called it Touchless Kiosk RASB.NET, because it kind of grabs all of the intricacies about what our application is going to have to handle. A touchless interface. It's going to be effectively a kiosk for an end user. It's going to be driven by Raspberry Pis, and the Raspberry Pis are going to be networked together.
So put the stakeholders in the project or in the
It's going, so inside, I'm gonna share this document. The document's gonna show that that's gonna go inside of the Capstone project directory. So we're gonna already start publishing our content in there in a systems requirements subdirectory. So we'll create a folder that holds all of our requirement analysis stuff, all of the things, all of our ideation stuff, and that's where it's going to live at. And since it'll be a markdown form, you won't have to even pull the content to be able to kind of read through it. You can click on each of the markdown pages and it'll render right inside of GitHub so that you can just look at through the web page. And again, that's not just for everyone's ability to access it cleanly and easily while developing, but when you go to show this off to a prospective employer, they can kind of cull through it as well very easily without having to pull the project.
Then, okay, and then for us to come on consensus with all of these tasks, we would have to do it offline or within the 15 minutes in between workshops?
Well, we could do it through Discord, which because probably making decisions is going to likely be, I'm expecting to be more a pod per pod issue. So we might not have to bring in the entirety of the class in that discussion. So it might make more sense to kind of handle that offline. But we'll see how this works as we move forward. And then I'll agilely adapt to find practices that makes things as kind of equitable as possible.
When so we're gonna talk to, it has to be one particular person each time. Like if I'm talking in front of a class, I can't talk about the kiosk.
Are you talking about for the interviews?
Yeah.
So the interview is it just has to be, yeah, an individual person that's going to be a continual stakeholder for the entirety of the semester. So when you approach your stakeholder, make sure that they're going to be kind of receptive to being part of the process as we move forward. So like as we get an MVP build, you might want to invite them in and actually try out what's been built so they can give their feedback towards what they might want to add to the system. Does that make sense? And again, we'll have a software engineering lab. So as our application slowly comes together, you'll have a place where you can invite your stakeholders to actually experiment with the equipment. Excellent. If there's nothing else, I should really kind of leave because I think we ended about 10 minutes ago. But again, I knew I was going to hijack this particular time frame because there was a lot to discuss about the project that was long overdue. So this puts us in a good reference point where a week, about a month from now, I want to be in a position where we can start having teams start getting code done. Okay.